Hi, my name is Levi Jones, and I am particularly interested in preaching and how that impacts communities, how preachers can do that task better, more faithfully. One of the things that I would like to talk to you about today is the idea of the emotive and cognitive arc in a sermon. You've probably seen or even have done some sermons that were maybe very vivid in terms of their imagery, the emotive kinds of language that may have been used would have allowed people to connect with the stories or the ideas pretty easily. But perhaps it lacked some depth, didn't have content to it. It may have had a bunch of stories that were interesting, but in the end of it, it was kind of like cotton candy, not good for a real meal, not satisfying in that kind of way. On the other hand, you may have heard sermons that stayed in kind of academic ideas, up in the realm of theory, very dry and hard to connect with, and very difficult to figure out, okay, well, how do we take these ideas and actually put hands and feet to them? What does this mean practically? And so we maybe have a really great idea that we've been wrestling with, but in terms of everyday sort of application, we struggle to figure out what that might look like. So I want to talk about some ways that you can bring about engagement from your audience and also to deepen the content by focusing on the emotive cognitive arc. So part of what we want to focus on when we're talking about emotive kinds of language and cognitive kinds of language, these are not separate necessarily. One may, as one of my professors said, take the driver's seat, and the other is in the passenger seat, kind of helping give directions. But there's one that's kind of in the foreground. So in terms of the emotive cognitive arc in a sermon, you generally want to start with the emotive in the driver's seat. The emotive is usually dealing with experiential language that engages the five senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, all those sorts of things that allow people to engage through their experiential lenses whatever sort of story or idea that you're beginning to unfold. What this begins to do is to say, why should I care about what you're talking about? Why should I engage and listen to you for 20, 30, 40 minutes? Why should this matter to me? And what it begins to do is also bypass, in some sense, some of the perhaps barriers that might be built up in a congregation or parishioners or hearers from actually entering in. One of the beautiful things about a story is that it naturally engages us. This is one of the ways that we naturally communicate ideas about our lives, share stories. And so when you begin to talk about emotive language, you would generally talk about stories that engage our experience. And it can be done in different ways. It can be a narrative, or it can also just use experiential language where our senses are engaged in listening to the ideas that are being unpacked initially. But even as you are engaging in the emotional language, the cognitive side of our brains is still at work. So if there's a story or emotive language that's being used in the very first introduction to gain engagement from the audience, the question that's coming up is, okay, so where's this going? Why does this matter? How is this connected? And so the passenger side, the cognitive side, is keeping us in line with where we're going to be going. As you continue that, the kind of middle arc of the emotive cognitive arc is the cognitive now begins to take the front seat, and the emotive moves to the side. Cognitive is the part where we would maybe do unpacking of exegesis, the important ideas that will be formational for us to engage both scriptural text and our own personal context. So here you can talk about academic ideas, But you have to be careful in how you're doing that. If you're talking to an academic audience, of course, you can use academic language, soteriology, ecclesiology, or whatever it is, and that's quite appropriate. If you're talking to a congregation where they may not be familiar with those terms, you can still engage those kinds of ideas, but here's where the emotive language becomes important. Rather than them just being ideas, you begin to pack them in images, analogies, metaphors, experiential language that helps these concepts come alive. And so, you may talk about soteriology, salvation, creation of space, through kind of emotive language. Harriet Tubman was a lady that was kind of a person that created space for those that were enduring intense, often heinous acts against humanity in the American slave institution. So you could talk about salvation through her story or perhaps some other story. So rather than using soteriology, you begin to flesh it out. This is what salvation looks like. So even as you engage the cognitive ideas, packing it in emotive language allows the people, again, to continue to engage. But here you're really working on the concepts and ideas that will give it depth and substance. And then, as you have had time to talk about both the problem and the solution in the context of the cognitive ideas, you would naturally go to some sort of conclusion. And the conclusion needs to have, again, the emotive back in the front seat. This is the opportunity for the congregation to celebrate, for the pastor or preacher to begin to, again, allow the cognitive concepts to come back into the practical. So here, it's not so much about the cognitive ideas, which have already been talked about in the middle of the sermon, but it's an opportunity for the congregation to respond in ways that are about praise and thanksgiving, perhaps lament, sorrow, repentance. So these go beyond the kind of cognitive mental ideas of dealing with something, a response that just stays in the head, but here you wanting to help it move into the area of the heart. And so the emotive language, again, allows us to do that. It's not that it's not cognitively important or not still connected to the cognitive, because, again, everything has to have a flow, everything has to be connected. And so in the conclusion, you're still wanting to have a very tight focus that has been developed from the introduction to the middle of the sermon and now to the conclusion. So cognitive language is still important, but the focus isn't on introducing new ideas, but allowing people to celebrate or to perhaps lament what has been developed in the prior parts of the sermon. So when we're talking about the emotive and cognitive arc, we want to keep in mind both the emotive and the cognitive are constantly working together, perhaps switching back and forth, but always in the passenger seat as one takes over the other, helping to give direction, helping to continue to shape the sermon as you go along.